Today on WW1 War Tales, we walk into the fog, fire, and forgotten echoes of the Western Front. This is the true, human, and emotional story of one soldier, one promise, and one battlefield that swallowed thousands. This is a long journey, heavy, honest, and told the way history rarely tells it. Let's begin. When the year was 1916 and Europe drowned in smoke, 20-year-old Thomas Elwood stepped onto the battlefield, believing that courage alone could carry a man through war. He had never held a rifle before. He had never heard artillery thunder across the horizon. He had never seen men crumble under fear or rise under fire. All he carried was a worn photograph of his younger sister, Clara, and a small promise he whispered to her before leaving home. "I'll come back, no matter what this war becomes." The journey to the front began with a long, sleepless train ride. Soldiers talked loudly at first, talk of medals, talk of heroism, talk of returning before Christmas. But as the train neared the front line, their voices slowed, then faded. No man wanted to speak over the rumble of distant artillery. Thomas stared out of the window, watching villages blur, past quiet, empty, broken. This was not the world he knew. This was a world swallowed by war. When he arrived at the Somme sector, the first thing he heard was the screaming of shells overhead. The second thing he noticed was the mudless, thick, suffocating mud that pulled at boots and swallowed hopes. Trenches stretched 4 miles like scars across the earth. Soldiers with hollow eyes greeted him without smiles. Their uniforms were soaked, their hands trembling, but their spirits, though bruised, were not yet defeated. Thomas was assigned to a dugout with men he barely knew. Nights were long. Days were longer. The rat-infested trenches became a coffin-shaped home. Rainwater pooled at their feet. The smell of smoke, sweat, and sickness never left the air. Every sunrise brought new fear. Would today be the day they climbed the ladder into no man's land? Time passed, strangely. Some days felt endless. Others disappeared in seconds. Thomas learned to fire his rifle with steady hands, not because he was fearless, but because fear had become part of his heartbeat. He learned to sleep through artillery barrages. He learned to eat hardened bread and canned beef. He learned that silence was more terrifying than explosions, because silence meant the enemy was preparing something worse. One cold evening, rain hammered the dugout roof while Thomas wrote a letter to Clara. His handwriting shook as he described the mud, the cold, the nights without sleep. But he didn't tell her everything. He didn't tell her about the soldier beside him who cried silently each night. He didn't tell her about the wounded men lost between the lines, their voices echoing in darkness. He didn't tell her about the fear that lived inside him like a shadow. He only wrote one promise: "I will come back." Then came July 1st, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, one of the bloodiest in human history. At dawn, a whistle pierced the sky. Thousands climbed from the trenches and charged forward. Thomas felt the ground tremble under his boots. Shells exploded like thunder. Machine guns sprayed fire. Men fell before they had taken 5 steps. Thomas ran because stopping meant death. He could feel the air tear past his ears. Soil burst upward beside him. He dropped into a shell crater, gasping for air as chaos roared around him. Hours passed like minutes. Every heartbeat was a gamble. When night fell, the battlefield was a graveyard of broken bodies. Thomas crawled through mud, his uniform torn, his face wet with blood, some not. He made it back to his trench, collapsing from exhaustion. The officer said nothing. No one spoke. The battlefield had spoken enough. The following weeks were a blur of loss. Friends vanished in seconds. Sometimes pieces of uniforms landed in the mud, the only sign a man had existed. Thomas felt himself growing colder inside, not heartless, just numb, as if his heart was trying to protect itself. Yet every night, he touched his sister's photograph and whispered the same promise: I'll come back. One night, after a long stretch of fighting, Thomas was ordered to join a night patrol across no man's land. Darkness hid everything except the faint glow of flares. The air smelled of smoke, wet soil, and danger. Thomas crawled carefully, feeling each inch with his hands. He heard gunfire in the distance, the hum of insects, the quiet breathing of the men beside him. Then the silent Shatarda flare burst overhead, bathing the battlefield in cold white light. Enemy rifles fired instantly. Thomas threw himself behind shattered debris. Bullets sliced through the night. He could barely breathe. He could barely think. All he could do was press himself against the ground and pray the firing would end. Hours later, the patrol limped back to the trench, exhausted, shaken, alive. Thomas collapsed into mud, trembling. Every heartbeat reminded him he was still living but barely. Winter was worse. Snow mixed with mud made the trenches unbearable. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Water turned to ice reflex command. Men coughed endlessly. The wounded groaned through the night. The living felt as though death sat beside them, waiting with patience. Thomas felt himself slipping into despair, but every time he wrote home, he forced his words to remain hopeful. He would not let his sister feel his fear. He would not let her lose faith. Then came a morning when orders arrived. Prepare for another assault. Thomas climbed the firing step, heart pounding. The whistle blew. Shells screamed. Men roared. The charge began. He ran forward with mud splashing under his boots. Explosions lifted bodies into the air. The sky was red. The ground shook. His ears rang. Somewhere between the trenches and enemy lines, a shell exploded beside him, throwing him to the ground. His vision blurred. His ears went silent. All he could taste was dirt and blood. When he tried to stand, pain shot through his leg. It fell again. The world around him faded. Voices echoed distantly, men shouting, calling for medics. Thomas reached for his pocket, pulled out his sister's photograph, and whispered, "I tried." Then everything went dark. He woke days later in a field hospital, unable to move his injured leg. Nurses spoke softly as they cleaned wounds, changed bandages, and whispered prayers for the dying. 4 weeks, Thomas drifted between pain and memory. The doctor finally told him he was being evacuated from the front, his injury too severe. When Thomas returned home in early 1917, he was not the boy who had left. He walked with a limp. He slept with nightmares. Loud noises made him flinch. But he kept his promise. He returned to his sister alive, scarred, changed, but alive. He spent his life rebuilding what war had stolen. He worked. He healed slowly. And when the war finally ended in 1918, Thomas stood before a memorial stone engraved with the names of his fallen comrades. He whispered softly, "I came back, but I carry all of you with me." Years passed. Thomas grew older, but he never forgot the mud, the fire, the fear, or the promise that carried him home. And before he died peacefully in his sleep, he placed one thing beside his bed. The worn photograph of his sister, edges curled, colors faded, but full of the hope that kept him alive. This was his journey through the ashes of the Western Front, a story of survival, memory, and a promise stronger than war itself. If this story moved you, stay connected with WW1 War Tales for more long, emotional, and forgotten journeys from the Great War. Like, share, and subscribe so these voices continue to live. Tell me which WW1 story you want next, and I'll bring it to life. Thank you for watching.